Clench your teeth and with both feet astride, firmly planted in the ground, withstand the foe. This is the battle cry of the Phrygian Knights, an Imperial Fist successor chapter, founded by Antigonus Curtes, who was formerly a captain of the 547th Phalanx Warding Company. Their Primarch, Rogaldorn, ordered the formation of the Phrygian Knights during the Third Founding to establish a firm and permanent presence of his sons in the galactic Far East, between Hexos, Formund, and Asilis. The warriors of Antigonus Curtes made their home the world of Koringal in the Phrygian subsector during the dawn of the 32nd millennium, and since then, the chapter has battled against the enemies of mankind, using the Phrygian subsector as a linchpin for their expeditions. Their notable campaigns are many, such as the 3 battles of Alamein, the retreat from Carter Dust, and the Anabasis of Stratonike, and the battle for Koringal in M42, to name a few. Koringal is currently classified as a hive world. Its colonists have conquered the whole surface of the planet around the 36th millennium. Initially, during the times known as Old Night, the planet was colonized by humans of a nearby star system, then settling in the arid plateau in the main continent of Midays. The world was quite diverse by this period, having large grasslands, thick forests, cold tundras, and dry steppes. In a certain faraway land, the cold is so intense that words freeze as soon as they are uttered, and after some time then thaw and become audible, so that words spoken in winter go unheard until the next summer. An ancient Koringal legend. For the next few millennia, the colonists merely survived on its surface, for the wild was ripe with dangerous beasts, and the lack of trade and resources kept the population low. It was in this context that the Great Crusade fleet, commanded by Captain Antigonus Curtes of the 547th Imperial Fist Company, arrived in the system in the 5th year of the 31st millennium. Compliance was done with immediate effect, and soon enough, all 5 planets in the star system were claimed by the Imperium, while afterwards Antigonus continued his advance, conquering many systems near this region of the galaxy. However, the appearance of the Ruined Storm during the first year of the Horus Heresy forced the Imperium forces to halt and consolidate their strength upon the already conquered worlds. Meanwhile, the light of the Astronomicon was lost to the navigators of Antigonus's fleet, and a dozen systems nearby had major uprisings, all followed by self-inflicted bloodbaths throughout their population. The strife in the region was eventually put down by the Imperial Fists under Antigonus, keeping tight his hold of the Phrygian subsector after initial failures in his attempt to lead the sector towards Terra through the Ruinstorm. Around half a decade later, with the Ruinstorm finally and suddenly diminished, all Imperium forces left for Terra, leaving Koringal and the subsector ungarrisoned and defenseless. It would take approximately 1 millennium since their departure for forces loyal to the Imperium to appear again in the orbit of Koringal. The subsector had succumbed to madness, with several warring tyrants ruling over the population of the few worlds still inhabited. Therefore, Warden Antigonus, lord of the newly founded Phrygian Knights, had to bring into compliance once more the world of Koringal and the subsector at large. After a brief month-long campaign of reconquest, the Phrygian Knights settled their forces in one of the few large islands in Koringal, the Isle of Aspartea. The Space Marines of the Phrygian Knights are revered across Koringal, lauded as saviors and protectors, and the loyalty to the Imperium by the citizens of the planet is unquestioned. Generally, the population lives in a moderate standard of well-being, and they are usually ruled by competent planetary governors. However, as it is with every high world, there are billions of poor souls in its depths, and it is there that the Phrygian Knights have one of their 2 recruitment zones as they capture young promising children, those that were part of gangs, criminals, or mere survivors. The other and main recruitment zone is the feral world of Fortuna in the Hestea system. The fortress of the chapter was designed and built by the first tech marine of the Phrygian Knights, Brother Niarchos, and Warden Antigonus Curtes himself. Its construction took near a decade, and most of the Isle of Aspartea, which would give its name to the fortress itself, was engulfed in ceramite and concrete. The building is not considered holy or sacred by the Phrygian Knights, and so it is not referred to as a fortress monastery, but only as a fortress, though its belly holds many of the artifacts and relics acquired by the chapter, as well as the chapter's armory and anything else that is required for the good functioning of a Space Marines chapter. In addition, inside Aspatea, there is the Hall of Remembrance, where all banners and symbols of lost silver shields, heteros, and sergeants are depicted. In the center of the hall, there stands one massive stone slab, which is referred to as the Stele, that has engraved in its surface the names of each Phrygian Knight Space Marine that has been lost in the wars against the enemies of the Imperium. The stele and the banners and symbols are updated during the ceremony of the Vigil to the Honored that occurs every 150 years. An inscription at the top of the stele inside the Hall of Remembrance reads, "I am a portrait in stone. I was put here by Antigonus Curtes, where I remain forever, the symbol of timeless remembrance." The subsector of Phrygia is located in the Ultima Segmentum. It is composed of 9 star systems, with 6 of them being heavily populated in M42. This region of galaxy space was first colonized by humans during the Dark Age of technology. A household legend across the Phrygian systems is that the colonists were Terrans from the mythical Achaemenid Empire, though such remains unconfirmed. Since the beginning of the firm presence of the Imperium through the Phrygian Knights chapter, the subsector has thrived, but several times war was waged across the system, the region suffering invasion from orcs, heretics, and renegades. Currently, the Cicatrix Maledictum blocks the light of the Astronomicon from reaching the subsector, and amidst the chaos of Imperium Nihilis, it stands effectively alone, with the Phrygian Knights being the only hope of security and protection. The Phrygian Knights field 9 companies, each nominally having 100 Astartes. Outside of these, the chapter usually has about 20 to 60 Kubernetes, ship captains in charge of each vessel of the Phrygian Knights, 4 Hypaspest, that are the Praetorians, are the leaders of the chapter, and a varied number of Phrarches, Iatras, and Oracleos. The Warder is the lord of the chapter, the name being a reference to the rank of Phalanx Warder in the Imperial Fist Legion. The companies are each named for one of the systems in the Phrygian subsector, and they are led by the Silver Shields. Under them, there are the Heteros, this rank being equivalent to the lieutenant rank in the 7th Legion, and lastly, there are sergeants, each commanding a squad. The chapter does not field a scout company, for newly forged Astartes are first deployed in the fire support squads. Later, the Space Marine can either go to the battle line or close support squads, depending on the strategic necessities, the losses taken, or his personal combat preferences. However, only the most experienced and strongest warriors of each company take part in the Somatophilic squads, a unique unit type of the chapter that carries breacher shields and is the core of the Phrygian Knights' efforts to break the backs of its enemies. The greatest honor in the line ranks of the chapter is to become a Somatophilix of the Coringal Company. Furthermore, all 8 standard companies, and so excluding the Coringal Company, are equals hierarchically speaking, and that trickles down to their individual Astartes. Thus, when 2 or more of these companies wage a war together, a non-permanent position of strategos is used for the war effort to have a single unified command. Unlike Codex-compliant chapters, the Phrygian Knights do not distinguish from reserve or battle companies, for all 9 companies of the chapter are battle companies, while they are all similar in the composition of the squads, assets, support and vehicles, though the Coringal Company is the most well-equipped, supplied, and with the greatest amount of vehicles, relics and dreadnoughts. Most commonly, the Phrygian Knights form 3 expeditions, the main one under the Warder and 2 others under different strategos, with one most battered company recovering in Coringal and organizing recruitment runs. However, in this time of crisis, the chapter has been seen to muster in one consolidated command and to deploy with their full strength at a specified theater of war, and in the opposite manner, more than 3 expeditions can still happen even though it is rare. The Agema Iatras, Agema Oracleas, and Agema Phrarches are equivalent to the Master of the Apothecarian, Chief Librarian, and Master of the Forge from standard Space Marine chapters, respectively. Together with the first company captain, which is named as the Agema Silvershield, they act alongside the Warder in the main Phrygian Knight campaign in any given time. Hypaspest are 4 permanent bodyguards of the high members of the Phrygian Knights, protecting the Warder, the Agema Iatras, the Agema Phrarches, and the Agema Oracleas. They wear tactical dreadnought armor and a number of different weapons and walk as shadows behind those they are protecting, never leaving their side. These Space Marines are not in the regular chain of command, but as they have a seat in the Synedrion, they are counted upon to give advice and counsel at the most appropriate circumstances. They are the Praetorians of the chapter, defending the members in the top of the chain of command. In this, they are a variation from the Huskarls of the 7th Legion during the Great Crusade. Due to the lack of Terminator armors in recent millennia, the Hypaspist are the only Space Marines of the chapter that wear it, for those few that are available are withheld for them and for when requirements are met, such as the appearance of a Space Hulk. Ajima Silvershield is the equivalent to the first company captain from regular Space Marine chapters. Thus, he commands the Korengal company of the Phrygian Knights. He is the right hand of the warder, and it is tradition that the Korengal company is always deployed alongside the warder himself. Silvershield is the Phrygian Knights' equivalent to the standard company captains. They are also in charge of the rituals, traditions, and the state of mind of their own respective companies, as the rank of chaplains is not fielded by the Phrygian Knights. Each company led by the 9 Silvershields are named for one of the systems in the Phrygian subsector, the first company, led by Ajima Silvershield, having the honor of being the Korengal company. Strategos is a non-permanent position in the chapter that appears when 2 or more regular companies are deployed together. They are the overall commanders of a campaign of war, and the Silvershields present decide amongst themselves, either through an informal election, sparring matches, or war games, who shall take the position. When the warder or the Ajima Silvershield are in the theatre of war, the position is not applied, as they both are automatically the commanders of the Phrygian Knights' forces. This position is similar to the Fleet Master and Lord Castellan ranks in use in the 7th Legion during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. All of these aforementioned positions, in addition to the Kubernetes of the capital ships of the chapter, from the Synedrion, the War Council of the Phrygian Knights. If the chapter is divided in many expeditions, each of them will have their own Synedrion, formed from the ranks listed above. The Synedrion acts as advisors to the leader of the expedition, be it the warder, a strategos, or a Silvershield, and they gather when the expeditions are at a crossroads, when each decision creates unforeseen ripples in fate. Kubernetes. These are Space Marines that have shown a mastery of void warfare, and one of them is permanently assigned to every ship of the chapter, captaining them without interruption. They act directly under the orders of the strategos, Silvershield or warder, depending on who is present. They do not see much of personal combat themselves, that occurring mostly only when their own vessels are boarded by their enemies. Currently, there are 30 of them, assigned from the flagship of the chapter, the Indushimaris' Revenge, to their many escort ships. Heteros is the Phrygian Knights' equivalent to the Lieutenant of the Imperial 5th Legion. Though this rank fell to oblivion after the Horus Heresy in most Space Marine chapters, the Phrygian Knights continue fielding them throughout their history. 2 per company, they serve directly under the command of the Silvershield, and in turn they command the sergeants. Each Heteros leads a formation, and the units under them are not permanent, but are chosen by the Silvershield in an ad hoc fashion, modeled by tactical and strategic requirements in their campaigns. Nobly comes death to him who in the van, fighting for the Emperor's lands, has made his stand. Creed of the Somatophilics. In addition to the standard battle line, fire support and close support squads, the Phrygian Knights have since their inception fielded 3 squads of Somatophilics. These Space Marines join combat with massive breacher shields and carry a bolter, as well as a power sword or chainsword. They are the most veteran and renowned warriors of each of their companies, and generally they are deployed where the fight is expected to be the thickest. They seek to first hold the enemy advance and then break through it and shatter the foes of the Emperor at its core. Furthermore, the Somatophilics are experts in boarding actions, being the first ones to land in the enemy vessels from their boarding torpedoes. Occasionally, when the battlefield is large and wide enough, they also ride on bikes as they charge into the foe, their shields maglock to their left. When this happens, the Somatophilics' charge is a sight to behold. The current Phrygian Knights Synedrion is formed by Warder Ariavestes, Ajima Silvershield Thorax, Ajima Iatros Argeus, Ajima Oracleus Pythius, Ajima Phorarchus Andronicus, Kubernetes Medeus of the Indushimaris' Revenge flagship, Kubernetes Plastius of the Bellerophon battle barge, Kubernetes Memnon of the Condors battle barge, and finally Hypaspis Plutarchus, Hypaspis Caranus, Hypaspis Orestes, and Hypaspis Tarzanor. Though the chapter has a very significant fleet that has ranged from 30 to 70 ships throughout history, the Phrygian Knights have always had an important drawback in terms of vehicles, except for Thunderhawks. Each company has but a handful of vehicles, and the mobility of its forces when fighting in prolonged land engagements depends on the Thunderhawks and aerial superiority, which, if exploited by an enemy, can severely ground the chapter's units. The Phrygian Knights have a strong martial tradition that results in them having many types of different competitions for different purposes, such as the filling of the most officers' ranks of the chapter. The Phrygian Knights seek to banish pride and arrogance from their recruits and warriors, for this, they believe, is the hubris that may lead to defeat. And defeat for them is not when they are denied their goals temporarily, for the Phrygian Knights are masters of operational and strategic maneuvers during their campaigns. But when Astartes of the Phrygian Knights and their allies are lost in battle in vain through arrogance, pride, or poor strategic observations. In this, the Hall of Remembrance in the fortress of Aspateia exists not to show the living the honor that exists in dying in combat, but the honor of those that are named or represented there have gained through their life service to the Emperor. Because of this, giving up the larger goal at hand, that is, the furthering of the lands of the Emperor and the protection of mankind, and deciding instead for a last stand, simply because of pride or not living with tactical defeats or other failures, is the greatest shame for the Phrygian Knights. Ironically, they thus are not against tactical withdrawals or retreats at all, and indeed they do often pursue them, be it in a squad or a whole expedition fleet. However, the Phrygian Knights only do such when the alternative that they are seeking would result in a greater efficiency in killing of their enemies. This rather calculus tradition is at odds with most of the Imperial Fist's successors and has been badly received by many situational allies of the Phrygian Knights, such as some Imperial Guard regiments and the Grecian Space Marine chapter. In addition, the chapter has over the 10 millennia since its formation increasingly shown a certain attachment towards the Phrygian subsector and their homeworld of Korengel, in the sense that they fear, if the entirety of the chapter is mustered elsewhere, that the subsector shall be destroyed. Since the Battle of Korengel, and due to the fact that the subsector is situated in Imperium Nihilis, the Phrygian Knights have shown this trait in excess. Half of their forces are at all times in the subsector. If this is a sign of weakness, passiveness, or simple necessary caution, it is not yet known. The Phrygian Knights' traditions. Feast of Blades. The Phrygian Knights take part in the centennial competition of honor amongst the Imperial Fist successors and the original chapter. Usually, one single escort vessel, captained by the aspirant champion, is sent to Inwit to join and participate in the feast. The Last Fall. The chapter is bound to the Imperial Fists and their other successors. The oath that Antigonus Curtis took when he more than willingly accepted the last protocol in front of Rogaldon himself is retaken when every new warder is chosen to lead the chapter after the death of the previous. This protocol calls for the unification of the Imperial Fist successors if terror is threatened. The only known activation of it was during the War of the Beast, and the warder Python answered the call with over 800 of his Space Marines, though he was delayed and only arrived in the final days of the war. Vigil to the Honored. Every 150 years or so, the chapter musters in its entirety in the Phrygian subsector, and at the fortress of Aspateia, a ceremony led by the warder is held in place, where every lost Space Marine of the Phrygian Knights is named by the silver shields of the companies. The symbols of the sergeants and the banners of the silver shields that have been killed in action are also added to the Hall of Remembrance. Days afterwards, the entire chapter joins in sparring competitions, regicide matches, and tactical and strategic war games taken across the fortress of Aspateia, and it is in this time that the composition of the new expedition fleets of the chapter is made by the warder. In the final days of the chapter's muster, each Silver Shield will take his company to the system in the Phrygian subsector that has given their names for their company and will join ceremonies and parades across the world. These dates are the most important celebrations for the humans of the Phrygian subsector as they get close with the Phrygian Knights before the Space Marines plunge themselves into the void to wage wars of the Emperor of Mankind. During a parade, in a vigil to the honored, there is a story recorded about Gerardus. a Phrygian knight of really ancient times who, when asked by a Coringalian child what their punishment for cowardice was, said, "There are no cowards among us, human." When the latter replied, "But what if there should be one?" Gerardus' answer was, his fine would be a great beast which bends over middays to drink from Aspatea. The child was amazed at this and said, "But how could there be a beast of such size?" At which Gerardus laughed and said, "But how could there be a coward among the Phrygians?" A legend as told by an elder of Coringal, date unknown. The Forging. The forging is the ceremony taken when a neophyte is ready to become a battle brother of the chapter. This is done on the fortress of Aspatea with any Phrygian knights that are present, and they take their oaths to Roguldaun, the emperor, and Antigonus Curtis. The oath-taking. Every 300 years, meaning every other vigil to the honored, the warder of the Phrygian knights chooses one silver shield and his company to take the path of the oath-taking after the ceremonies in the Phrygian subsector. This path leads to the Phalanx, the flagship of the Imperial Fists chapter. This honored Phrygian Knights company crosses the galaxy for Terra or for wherever the Phalanx may be, and inside it they retake their oaths from their forging in the legendary Temple of Oaths. The silver shield, in the name of the Phrygian Knights, also renews the oath of the whole chapter to the Imperial Fists and the last wall. Those that have made this path and returned mark their left kneecap of their power armor with a black clenched fist. Setting the stone. Setting a stone takes place when a sergeant, a heteros, or a silver shield is challenged in their positions from their direct subordinates, or when one of these ranks is vacant due to losses taken in the field. All those that have stepped forth for the vacant position, or those that have challenged their superior alongside the challenged himself, participate in duels in sparring cages and war games. The one that has the most victories in both categories wins the position. To set the stone, one must only proclaim it once through his unit and to his superior, though it is tradition that it does not take place during active engagements. Being challenged is not considered a dishonor, but a chance to prove yourself, and if one fails, it means he wasn't the most fitting to lead his unit, and thus he has to work himself towards increasing his skill and his tactical and strategic grasp. And in the opposite view, challenging your superior does not mean you think he is weak or unfit for duty, but only that, if there is anything to be improved, it should be tested thoroughly, and the way to do it is through these challenges. Of all officer ranks in the chapter, only the Ajima Silver Shield and the Warder are not decided through the setting of a stone, as the Ajima Silver Shield automatically becomes the Warder if he is lost in battle, and it is the Warder that chooses a new Ajima Silver Shield from amongst the Silver Shields or, alternatively, heteros of the Coringal Company. The Oath of Alcetes. The chapter is bound to the host of Alcetes' chapter with the Oath of Alcetes, when Warder Alcetes pledged, invoking the names of Roguldaun, Antigonus Curtis, and the Emperor himself, to answer any and all calls for assistance coming from the host of Alcetes. The warlord of the Iarchaidoi then pledged the same. These oaths were sworn after the climactic battle for Coringal at the start of the 42nd millennium, when the host of Alcetes came to the rescue of the Phrygian Knights and were decisive in the defeat of the Iron Warriors. The chapter gives equal attention to melee and ranged combat, a tradition caught from the Imperial Fist Legion. The Phrygian Knights' doctrine calls for the identification of the center of gravity of the enemy, where their efforts will be most optimal and efficient. Once identified, the position, leader, ship or unit is attacked by the Phrygian Knights, then concentrating their efforts. The Somatophylix units generally lead the main assault from the flanks, with several other units and vehicles in support, while the rest of the chapter ties the enemy down. In the Void, the Warders of Phrygia are masters of ship-to-ship combat and of boarding actions. In such battles, the Phrygian Knights attempt to achieve the greatest efficiency in their combat efforts, combining the assets of the vessels themselves to the Astartes of the chapter. In this manner, no boarding action is uncoordinated with the gunfire, targets, and movements of their vessels. The three main weaknesses of the chapter are the dependency on aerial superiority for long-range mobility, the relative lack of heavy armor and vehicles, except Thunderhawks, and the predictability of its set-piece battle tactics in land engagements, which can be exploited by clever enemies, as was the case of the Drukhari during the Third Battle of Alamein in M38. due to the reliance on the Somatophylex units, them acting as the hammer while the rest of the chapter acts as the anvil. The concentrated presence of the Somatophylex in a location gives it away that it is there where the Phrygian knights will focus their attempt to behead the enemy. Since the chapter always seeks to engage in set-piece decisive battles, the Phrygian knights usually attempt to evade besieging their enemies by drawing them out in the open. Thus, even though the Somatophylex units makes the chapter especially efficient while being besieged, they are not specialized in siege warfare, unlike the progenitors. Again, this is mostly because of the chapter's relative lack of heavy armor and artillery vehicles, though their fleet makes it up with an impressive orbital bombardment. The history of the chapter is complete with great victories, such as the assault upon Gerovian when the Phrygian knights led an imperial attack on an uncategorized Xenos empire in the edges of the galaxy, and the Phrygian campaign when the Coil Sigma Company successfully defended Koringal against an Orc war during the War of the Beast. But it is also marked by great tragedies and defeats, such as the disaster on Carpoinen, where Antigonus Curtis met his end, or the retreat from Cartadust, when the remaining forces of the chapter evacuated from the system after a new enemy emerged from beneath the great sand sea of Cartadust and devastated the Imperial fleet. The chapter's tale has gone crooked, and I cannot plead before the inexorable Emperor. All that remains is survival. Survival, no matter the odds, no matter the dishonor, no matter our pride. We run. Warder Seleucus during the retreat from Cartadust, M40. The allies of the Phrygian knights, the Grecian chapter, could do nothing but curse at the betrayal as they were left alone to perish against this new foe. Another notable campaign in the chapter's history is the 3 battles of Alamein fought in a lava world. As Alamein's star had a highly eccentric elliptical orbit around a black hole, for most of its year the lava ocean encapsulated the entire surface of the planet, covering everything beneath the lava. However, for the 3 days when Alamein approached the black hole, gigantic lava tidal waves were formed and parts of the surface were unraveled, opening a path to the surface and the Xenos pillars that were battled for by the Phrygian knights and the Drukhari, though every hour a different wave would pass through each of them. This left a small window of opportunity for the pillars to be investigated, and the ever-approaching waves also had to be dodged at every hour. In one engagement, an entire company of the Phrygian knights was bogged down by the mobile Drukhari and perished beneath the lava wave, while the warder Tlepolemus himself, when attacking the enemy during the 3rd battle, was cut off and surrounded, and his strategos that had returned from another expedition elsewhere in the galaxy could not reach his position in the surface in time. Then, as throngs of his enemies bore down upon him, and his hypaspist said, "They are making at thee, O warder." Who else, pray, said Tlepolemus, should be their mark, but Diodotus will come to my aid. This was his hope to the last, and to the last he kept watching eagerly for his strategos. Then a whole cloud of Drukhari projectiles were let fly at him, and he fell. The death of warder Tlepolemus during the 3rd battle of Alamein, M38. Warder Seikilos, previously the Agema Silver Shield of the Phrygian Knights, was reported as saying that, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Drukhari, we shall be utterly ruined." And yet, the most important battle in the chapter's recent history was the battle for Koringal. A few years before the invasion, the latest Vigil of the Honored of the Phrygian Knights took place in 998 M41. The entire chapter was mustered in Phrygia, the Space Marines joining celebrations and prayers with the civilians of all the 9 systems of the subsector, and the Silver Shields recording in the stele inside the Hall of Remembrance in the fortress of Aspatea the names of all Astartes of the Phrygian Knights lost since the last vigil to the honored. As is tradition, after the gathering, Warder Alcetes chose one of his companies, this time the Stratonite Company, under Silver Shield Demetrius, to take the path of oath-taking and renew the oaths of the chapter inside the Phalanx, the flagship of the Imperial Fists. The rest of the chapter separated in 2 expedition fleets, and they took to the stars. However, before they could reach their destinations, the Cicatrix Maledictum appeared, blocking the light of the Astronomicon. Alcetes then ordered the muster of the chapter once again in Phrygia, as contact was lost all across Imperium Nihilus and warp travel was made increasingly perilous. Sometime later, reports had arrived to warn Alcetes of uprisings in the Hestea system of the Phrygian subsector, which were forcing the commitment of most of the planetary defense forces of Hestea. The situation was aggravated when the orbital stations of Hestea were all captured by the rebels, and the planet became de facto under siege, all-out war happening in the hives. Though Alcetes thought the most efficient response would be a rapid strike with the entire chapter, a response which would in his estimations end the problem in less than a week, he was advised against it by his Agema Heracleius, a Phrygian knight named Pythias. Indeed, all the Heracleius of the chapter were foreseeing doom. A massive invasion fleet was about to strike Korengel. Each decision taken by Alcetes meddled with the threads of fate, and the future of the chapter and of the Phrygian subsector was unknown. Nevertheless, it was clear the situation in Hestea was bogging down important imperial military and navy elements that could assist the Phrygian knights. Therefore, Alcetes decided to stay put and ready the defenses of Korengel with 6 companies of the chapter, while he sent Silvershield Cassandros with the Hestea and Kilikia companies towards Hestea. Effectively, Cassandros was made a strategos of the chapter, the commander of an expedition force with 2 or more Silvershields. 2 days after the departure of Strategos Cassandros from Korengel towards Hestea, a massive Iron Warrior force was identified advancing to the Phrygian subsector. Then, word came to warder Alcetes of the plight of the host of Iacetes, the successor chapter of the Phrygian Knights. After the Cicatrix Maledictum, their entire chapter had become becalmed in the warp for months, suffering from Galafield failures and Chaos Demon invasions. When they managed to leave the warp, their ships were all heavily damaged, with no warp travel capabilities, and they found themselves in the Calatis system, a world long abandoned by mankind, its settlements and ruins having been mostly conquered once again by nature. This was the dream that Agema Heracleius Pythias had, foretelling of the incoming doom of the host of Iacetes. With the chapter standing at a crossroads, the Phrygian Knights Synedrion, or War Council, was gathered and they discussed the situation. Most, like the warder's hypaspist named Plutarchus, thought that it would be best to concentrate entirely on Korengel, while a few others, including Agema Heracleius Pythias, saw that the benefits of rescuing the host of Iacetes and gathering more reinforcements from outside would outweigh the issue of further splitting the chapter's forces. Many things which cannot be overcome when they are together yield themselves up when taken little by little, said Hypaspis Plutarchus to warder Alcetes during the Synedrion before the battle for Korengel. After much deliberation in the Synedrion, warder Alcetes ordered an expedition fleet of 2 companies, this one now under Strategos Thorax, to find and rescue the host of Iacetes at all costs, and hence Korengel was left with just 4 Phrygian knight companies. Crucial to this decision was the fact that warder Alcetes thought that reinforcements were absolutely necessary for his prospects on the upcoming battle for Korengel. The destruction of the host of Iacetes would be a major setback for the Imperium and also spell doom for the Phrygian Knights themselves. This was certain. The Heracleius of the chapter confirmed it. For them, the destiny of the Phrygian Knights was now permanently connected with the destiny of the host of Iacetes. Meanwhile, the Stratonite company under Silvershield Demetrius journeyed through the galaxy, at first in search of the Phalanx, and then to return to their homeland, the Phrygian subsector. In the Anabasis of Stratonike, they travelled across the Milky Way, and as it became known that the Phalanx was headed towards Cadia, Demetrius moved his expedition fleet with haste towards that system. The fleet arrived in the edges of the system when Cadia was falling, and the Phalanx leading the evacuation of the Imperial forces. Demetrius's vessels soon were assailed by the enemies of mankind, and he ordered a retreat as the Phalanx plunged itself into the warp. Eventually, the company indeed did as intended, and the oath-taking was complete. However, they were now separated from the Phrygian subsector and from the rest of the chapter due to the Cicatrix Maledictum. Demetrius's company joined the Indomitus Crusade, led by the returning Primarch of the Ultramarines, Rebuti Gilliman, though the Phrygian-bound path was always on the Phrygian Knight's mind. Countless battles and campaigns were taken by the Stratonite company in this time. During this period, the Stratonite company crossed the Rubicon Primaris, and though some failed, most were reborn and equipped as Primaris Space Marines. After years, at last when the Indomitus Crusade entered Imperium Nihilus and Guilliman's armada moved towards Baal to assist the Blood Angels against the Tyranid invasion, the Stratonite Company, quite depleted from 100 battles, was allowed instead to move towards the Phrygian subsector in search of the rest of the Phrygian Knights. After several encounters with a number of foes of mankind and repeatedly becoming lost in the warp, Demetrius and his company finally hailed a star within the Phrygian subsector, Thalata, a destination they greeted with a cry of exultation on the bridges of their vessels. Thalata! Thalata! Going deeper into the sector, they arrived in the Hestea system, aiding Cassandras' expedition fleets against the Alpha Legion. Later, the two companies under Cassandras, as well as the Stratonite Company under Demetrius, and all the Imperial military and navy forces on Hestea, all returned to the Koringal system and joined the battle for Koringal. Though greatly outnumbered, Warder Alcetes of the Phrygian Knights led the efforts of the Imperium in the system and managed to hold long enough in the fortress of Aspatea in the surface of Koringal until reinforcements from the two Phrygian Knights expedition fleets could arrive. The battle resulted in the destruction of the Ipsus shipyard of the world of Tyre and in the death of 618 Phrygian knights. The Imperium was in the end victorious, but these losses resulted in a major reduction of the Phrygian subsector capabilities and of the Phrygian knights' strength. The chapter and the system of Koringal still recovers from the battle. Currently, the chapter is only operational in the Phrygian subsector as it regrows to its full strength. A couple of years after the battle, custodians of the Emperor arrived with the Primaris gene seed. All the surviving members of the chapter would attempt to cross the Primaris Rubicon except Antigonus Gonatas, who had already done so during the Anabasis of Stratonike, the sole survivor of the battle for Koringal from that company. Warder Alcetes, a veteran of 1,000 battles, would die. Not in combat, not in a warp event or another catastrophic situation. Instead, the Warder of the Phrygian Knights died in his attempt to become a Primaris Space Marine. The future bears down upon each one of us with all the hazards of the unknown. The only way out is through. Silvershield Demetrius' speech to his company when they were separated from the rest of the chapter due to the Cicatrix Maledictum, Anabasis of Stratonike, 42nd Millennium.